see JaMyia McNeil now. All of our students, as I said before, all of our students, what's that? All of our students are precious to us. All of our students are loved by us. All of our students have individuality. This student, JaMyia McNeil, she's a little different. Here's why. She came through our Bridge Builders program. The Bridge Builders is an association, a conflation of the Macon County Ministers, the Macon County School Board, and Tuskegee University, the National Center for Bioethics. We came together and put together a program that took high school students and maximized both their theological and their academic and their intellectual perception of college so that they could go on not just to Tuskegee, not just to HBCUs, all of those were priorities, so that they could go on to any school. And JaMyia chose to come to Tuskegee University. And so when she came with a degree high, a grade average so high that she was able to be part of the Bioethics Honors Program. So we are especially proud of her. She's a daughter of Tuskegee. She is a child of Tuskegee University. She's one of our Bioethics Honors students, and she is last year, she presented at the Public Health Ethics Forum at the CDC. She's one of our student presenters. And so we are proud of this young lady. So remember her name. I always say I always get her name wrong. But JaMyia McNeil, you remember her name because you're going to see her again, just like Daniel Ryan. So Daniel, we want to thank Daniel Ryan for the excellent job he did in moderating the two. And now it's JaMyia McNeil's turn. And so JaMyia, introduce to us, read the information for Attorney McCrary, and then after she speaks, then you will read the information for Dr. Sowande Mustakeem. And just so you know, Sowande, my wonderful niece Karima, she's online here, so she is watching, so she's there with you. All right, JaMyia, take it, it's yours.
Hey, good afternoon. I am JaMyia McNeil, a sophomore occupational therapy major from Tuskegee, and I will be introducing Attorney Latasha McCrary. Latasha McCrary is an assistant federal public defender in the Northern District of Alabama, where she represents individuals accused of federal crimes. She previously served as a senior staff attorney for the Southern Poverty Law Center, where she supervised the center's juvenile justice work in Alabama, and served as a trial attorney in the class action lawsuit against the Alabama Department of Corrections. McCrary has dedicated her career to reforming Alabama's justice system to ensure equality is afforded to all juveniles and adults who interact with the criminal justice system, and to reduce the number of persons who are jailed, detained, and incarcerated. She has authored several journal articles that focus on criminal justice in Alabama, as well as articles on how to be successful as a young lawyer. She frequently serves as a panelist and lecturer on issues of mass incarceration, race, and criminal justice reform. She is the proud mother of 2 children, Charisma and Jordan. Her guiding principle, service is the price we pay for the space we occupy. And this is Attorney Latasha McCrary.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, JaMyia, and congratulations. I hope you have a wonderful experience at Tuskegee. Thank you to the Tuskegee staff for all that you've done to coordinate this event. It's really exciting. I joined in on just the tail end of the last conversation, and I'm sad that I missed the whole thing. But I will go back and watch the recording because it certainly seemed like a conversation that is worth us all having and taking action on to make this country a better place. So thank you again. I want to try to share my screen, and I hope I don't fail. Ashanti walked us through this last week, but I'm going to use it just to aid a little bit here. So let's see. I can do that. Is that working? Let's see. Yeah, it says you are sharing the screen.
Yes, it's clear.
Okay, great. So, I want to talk about this article, which is actually part of the bioethics journal that was printed in the last printing of the journal that went out this past summer. And the title is "To Be Young, Black, and Powerless." And I really want to focus and talk about disenfranchisement. The subtitle is "Disenfranchisement in the New Jim Crow Era," because I think there has been a lot of attention given to Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which is an excellent read. And what it talks about is how Blacks have been affected or are continued to be affected post Jim Crow by means of what we call disenfranchisement. And basically, that just means stripping people of their right to be able to vote. And so felon disenfranchisement specifically is about denying people the right to vote based on the fact that they have been previously or currently, or they've been previously convicted of a felon, whether they are no longer serving their time for that sentence, or whether they are currently serving time for a sentence, or parole, probation, any type of form of punishment. But the fact that they have been convicted has denied them of the right to vote. And I think that this is a very timely topic, obviously, because we just came out of the 2020 election, which we're all still excited about or scared about, just depending on what side of the fence you're on. And so to be able to talk to you all about how what we can do, and also how voting is affected, particularly how our next generation is going to be affected by felon disenfranchisement laws, is just exciting. So I took this quote from The Souls of Black Folk because I think that it definitely kind of, for me, shapes the discussion. And so what W.E.B. Du Bois said is that the power of the ballot is Blacks' only defense against the second slavery. When you begin to take that, I think you have to take it in many different pieces, but I think ultimately it boils down to something that is very true. We know that voting is a very powerful tool in this country, this United States, this democracy that we live in. We know that people have died, people have done so many things in order to obtain the right to vote, but also to be able to try to maintain their right to vote. And so it cannot be understated how powerful and important voting is. I think if you think about it in context, you can think back to 2 years ago when people started campaigning for the election that just happened one day last week. And so if it wasn't important, we wouldn't be spending 2 years of time campaigning, trying to figure out what people's issues are, trying to determine who is going to be on the ballot, what do those candidates stand for, how do those candidates impact our community, how do those candidates align with our interests. We wouldn't be doing any of that if it weren't important. So we know that voting is important, and we know that our individual votes and collective votes are powerful. We know that because that's why people are vying for our vote. That's why people are trying to sell their campaign and their ideas and their theories about what our country should be to us. Our votes and us as a constituency as a whole is very important to those candidates who are putting themselves out trying to be elected. I think that, again, this is a very important time because we're just coming out of this 2020 election. And if you've been paying any attention to some of the articles that have been written, you can see that what the studies are showing is that the Black vote in particular has made a significant difference in this election as well as prior elections. The Pew Center for Research said that there was record levels of Black voters that voted this year, that there was a record level of 30 million Black people that actually turned out in some form and voted in this election. When you look at the Democratic Party specifically, there are studies that show over the past several elections that the numbers of Black voters that have showed up for Democrats exceeds 90%, and how that has significantly affected Democratic candidates for president over the last 5 elections. So again, just pointing to the fact that Black votes matter. I think we all intuitively know that. We know that because of the studies that we see, but we also know that just because the data shows that when Black people turn out and vote, they actually make a very significant difference. And so it's great. We're at a great time right now where we can celebrate the potential and possibility of what we have. We can celebrate the 2020 election if it turned out the way that you wanted it to turn out. And we can plan for the future elections that will come up as well. But what I want to talk about today are the people who wanted to vote but could not vote. And the reasons why some of those people could not vote is because of what we call felon disenfranchisement. It's no secret that there have been significant efforts in our history as an American country to suppress the Black vote. Just as much as people are talking about how many Black voters turned out, there were lots of people that were trying to prevent us as Black people from showing up at the polls. We know that there was a lot of talk about areas that had large Black demographics, about how to suppress votes in those areas, whether it was to be able to deny people the right to do mail-in ballots, or require people to have certain identification or to go through certain steps in order to be able to exercise their right to vote, limiting early voting, combining voting places so that people would have to stand in line for long periods of time. Those were all things that we saw in this election. But if we look back at previous times, we also recognize that there have been things done to prevent Blacks from voting for years now. We often hear about the grandfather clause, we hear about poll taxes, we hear about literacy tests, all things that were put in place in order to be able to not deny people the right to vote. And these are all things that we generally associate with the Jim Crow era. And so I want to show here a quote from Michelle Alexander's book, which I think really ties into my topic here today. It says that today it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you are labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a Black man living in Alabama in the height of Jim Crow. And then she spends her book talking about why that's so. But what she is saying is that those same efforts that were made to be able to deny and suppress the Black vote during the Jim Crow era, the impact of that is being realized, continued to be realized, when we start to look at the number of Black people who are incarcerated or have been incarcerated in this country and who have lost their vote by means of a crime. And so I think sometimes it's one of those things that when we start talking about crime in America, it's one of those things that I think a lot of people don't want to be on the side of saying not to be tough on crime, or let's decriminalize, let's reduce charges or reduce punishment for people who have committed crimes. And so I think it's particularly for politicians, I think that's not what they want their message to be. Even if that's what they believe in, that's part of their policy once they are in office, no one wants to be campaigning on not being tough on crime. And so I think it becomes easy by way of media, and also because it's a topic that a lot of people find to be taboo to talk about, for us to not to really think about the impact of what is happening through our laws when people are stripped of their right to vote just because they have a felony conviction, which may be a conviction that they had 30 years ago, now have served their sentence in some form, paid their fines, and still here now have been a productive citizen and still don't have the right to vote. And so I want to talk a little bit, again, I focus on Alabama because that's specifically the state that I spend a lot of time studying their laws, but I want to just talk about the history of felon disenfranchisement in this country, but specifically in the state of Alabama. And so for us, it's not the very beginning of the law, but it certainly is where the law really got its teeth. Alabama's 1901 Constitution, which is still in effect here in 2020, it has been amended, and it has a lots of amendments to it, certainly more than the U.S. Constitution, but it is still an active Constitution that we have and that we use. In fact, almost every election, there's something about the U.S. Constitution which is on the ballot. This year, particularly, there was an amendment proposed to just take racial language out of a Constitution that's over 100 years old. And so that in itself just tells us something about the establishment of this Constitution. So the 1901 Constitution came together when a convention of 100% white men came together and decided that they wanted to figure out a way to maintain white supremacy in the state of Alabama. And that was the primary focus. I put the quote up there from the president. This is what he said on the opening address of the actual convention. He says, and what is it that we want to do? Why, it is within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution to establish white supremacy in this state. It was very clear about what the purpose was. They wanted to not only establish white supremacy, but they also wanted to deny the right to vote to Blacks and also to poor whites. Because what they wanted to do at the time was to maintain the power of white elites at the time. And so one of the members of the Constitution wrote a letter to his granddaughter. He sent her a pen that he'd used to sign his name on the Constitution. And in the letter, he said to her, "I wrote my name to our Constitution. This will never be forgotten. We have virtually disenfranchised the Negro." These are things that are part of records. These are things that people know about. These are not secrets. This isn't something that I had to dig up, do a lot of digging to be able to find. It is well known that our Constitution here in Alabama was established with the idea that it would maintain white supremacy and also largely to disenfranchise Black voters. In fact, what they ended up doing as part of it, in addition to the poll taxes, literacy tests, the grandfather clause, there was another provision that they put in this Constitution which said that people would be denied the right to vote if they were convicted of felony and non-felony crimes that involve moral turpitude. And I know that term moral turpitude, to me, when I first heard it years ago, I was like, what is that? And the truth is, in Alabama, there was no definition for it. And I don't think that that was by mistake. I think there wasn't a definition for it because that allowed for people to be able to make up whatever definition they wanted for it as they went along, depending on what they wanted to happen. And so when this was drafted into law, what they had predicted was that 60% of Black men would be denied the right to vote just based on the crime of wife beating alone. It also affected laws such as vagrancy or homelessness. And so there were just a number of things that would have people's lives or their right to vote would have been impacted by just based on this particular clause alone. So again, at the time that it was drafted, it included both felonies and misdemeanors. And in 1901, there were 181,000 Black voters. And shortly after that, there were about 3,000 Blacks who were still eligible to vote just based on this particular Constitution being codified. And so I think for us, that tells us a lot. First, it tells us that laws can be very impactful. And it's meaning that we also have to be able to pay attention to it. But it also tells us how powerful the Black vote is, and when it is suppressed, what significant difference that could have on our community. And so I'm going to go to my next slide here. So I want to just going up to the 2008 election, we saw just based on, we saw that there was a lot of conflict on who could vote based on this term moral turpitude. But before we got there, in 1985, there is a case called Hunter v. Underwood, which was taken up to the US Supreme Court. And I think this kind of ties into what the ladies were talking about in the last session, which is sometimes you just have to do the hard work of filing a lawsuit. And so someone filed a lawsuit here in the state of Alabama where they challenged the law, specifically they challenged the part of the law which disenfranchised people who had been convicted of misdemeanors involving moral turpitude. And so what the US Supreme Court did in 1985, they struck down that portion of the law, and they recognized when they did so that the law itself was based on the fact of trying to strip people of their rights to vote based on their color. And the Supreme Court said not only did it do it then, but it continues to have that effect even until this day. So as of 1985, the law was changed such that the only part of the provision which was still in place was felons who were convicted of crimes involving moral turpitude. So no longer misdemeanors as of 1985, only people who are convicted of felonies. So when we get to 2008, the presidential election then, that many of us were excited about because it was the opportunity to be able to have who ended up being the first Black president of the United States, President Barack Obama, on the ticket. I think people, if you remember, for those of us who were able to vote, and for those of us who hadn't reached voting age, we're just very excited about the time and the potential of being able to actually have a candidate on the ticket for a major party and also have that individual, someone who had the ability to be able to win and ultimately did win the election back in 2008. But if you remember back to those times, what was happening is there were a lot of concerns about who was going to turn out and vote, particularly Black people who were very interested in the turnout. And at that time, we also had record numbers of people who were turning out to vote, both Black and white and other races at the time. But I think that as a community of Black people, we were very excited about voting. But what was happening in our state of Alabama is that there was a lot of efforts to go back to the 1901 Constitution and try to prevent a lot of people in Alabama from voting based on the Constitution, which again stripped people of their right to vote now because of a felony conviction involving moral turpitude. And as I said to you a few minutes ago, there was no definition, even in 2008, there was no definition for what moral turpitude meant. And so what that ended up doing was leaving a lot of confusion and also a room for a lot of manipulation on how people would try to prevent individuals from voting. And so what we had here in our state is that there was one list that said there were 15 different crimes that disqualified people. There was another list from that was from the legislature. And then from the Administrative Office of Courts, there was a list that said 70 different crimes would disqualify you from voting. And then the governor's office, which happened to be a Republican at the time, had a list of over 500 crimes that they considered to disqualify people from voting. And so what happened is at the local level where you have your individuals who are actually having to implement those rules, they were actually preventing people from voting who they should not have been preventing from voting. Totally based on, again, a constitution that was codified and enacted back in 1901, it was still having the impact of disenfranchising people in 2008. Now, in 2017, the legislature finally came together and they gave moral turpitude a definition, one, and then they also codified a list of 60 crimes which now can disqualify you from voting. And so if a person is concerned or not sure if they have the right to be able to vote under Alabama's law, they now have actually a law that they can go to and say for sure it's on this list or it's not on this list. So I don't have to worry about any changes. But again, it took until 2017 to be able to get there. So just imagine the people that leading up to 2017, that actually whose lives and their votes were impacted just from lack of clarity and confusion from a law that originated back in 1901. And so let's talk a little bit, let's get into the statistics, some of felon disenfranchisement. And so again, the basic definition is just stripping people of their right to be able to vote. That's all that disenfranchisement means. And in the United States, nearly 6.1 million Americans are denied the right to vote based on a felony conviction. I went and looked at the numbers of people who voted in this year's election. And first I looked at Georgia because that's one that I think a lot of people were talking about because of its flipping from red to blue. But even the amount of people that showed up in Georgia did not meet the amount of people who have been disenfranchised in this country. So next I went to Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania has just a few 100,000 more people who turned out to vote than the number of people who actually cannot vote in the United States based on felon disenfranchisement. And so when you begin to think about that and unpack that, we know that Pennsylvania, which had 20 electoral votes or has 20 electoral votes, made a significant difference in the outcome of this election. And so if just carrying that through to a natural conclusion, that tells us that the number of people who cannot vote have the same, if not more power than the state of Pennsylvania showed us that it had in this 2020 election. So we're talking about not only a significant number of people, but we're just talking about, just in talking and thinking about impact, we can see that the impact of the number of people who are disenfranchised, it could have a significant impact if those people actually had the right to vote. Meaning it can make a change in the outcomes that we see not only in our national elections, but also at the local level, certainly at the local levels. This number and statistic has been around for a while, that 1 in 3 Black men at some point in their lives will either be jailed or imprisoned. It is a scary number. I have a 4-year-old son, and of course I have brothers and uncles and many male friends, and it is scary to think that 1 in 3 of those individuals will at some point in their life either have been jailed or to be imprisoned. And when we look specifically at the Black vote, the Black level of disenfranchisement, we know that Blacks are more affected than any other race when we're talking about this number of 6.1 million people who do not have the right to vote. Statistics show that Blacks are disenfranchised at a rate of 4 times other races. In the South, more than 1 in 5 Blacks are unable to vote due to felony convictions. If you paid attention to Florida over the last several years, specifically leading up to this election, starting 2 or 3 years ago, there was a large effort. In fact, in the last presidential election, there was an amendment on the ballot which would just allow people who had been stripped of their right to vote based on a felony to have that right restored without having to go through a formal restoration process. That amendment actually ended up passing, but since that happened, there was a lot of efforts to be able to try to undo what actually had been accomplished through the passing of that amendment. And so in Florida specifically, the level of disenfranchisement of Black people in Florida is extremely significant and was. And so this law was going to make a significant difference, not just on people who were affected by the law holistically, but particularly on the Black community, because the number of Black men specifically that are have been incarcerated in the state of Florida is extremely high. So I've been talking more broadly about disenfranchisement and just its impact on the voting population, particularly Black voters as a whole. But what I specifically want to talk about is why we as a Black community should be concerned about the future of the Black vote. I've already talked about just the significance that Black voter turnout played in this 2020 election. We could go back to other elections and we can find that the same thing could be true. But I want you to understand why as a community, we should be concerned about the future of our impact through voting on this country. And the reason why that is because the numbers of Black youth who are now being whose behavior is being criminalized, but who are now being convicted of felonies at young ages is increasing. And so I titled this section Imprisonment of Black Youth. And I have these pictures saved on my computer just to kind of remind me from time to time of the work that I do. But also just looking at these pictures actually bring me to tears, but they're pictures from the convict leasing system of young Black people. If you look at that field, those kids look like they're about between 7 and 10 years old, out working in the fields. Basically, it looks like maybe chopping cane. But ultimately, these were people who were, these were children who were in prison in this United States. And so it's no secret, this isn't new. But what I want to talk to you about some laws that we can, that we should be focusing on in order to be able to change the outcome of this. We know that Black children have been affected by our criminal justice system for a very long time. We could think back to some of the more national cases, such as the Scottsboro Boys or the Scottsboro Nine. Ava DuVernay just did a wonderful series on the Central Park Five that a lot of us watched and brought a lot of attention to what happened there in New York. We could also think back to George Stinney, who was a 14-year-old who was accused of hurting a Black girl. He was wrongfully accused of that, and he was executed in the state of South Carolina. He was so small that actually the equipment that they used to execute someone would not even fit his body. And all of these are things that happened before 2000. But they are not things that are just isolated to those times. Those are things that continue to be able to happen even now. And in many states, and again, my statistics will focus on Alabama, but in many states, there are ways in which people who are still minors are actually brought into the adult system. So if a person goes to a juvenile system, the juvenile system is focused on rehabilitating the child, providing the child with additional services, and ultimately protecting a child from the outcomes, the harmful outcomes that are associated with the felony. And so, for example, if a person gets what they call an adjudication in the juvenile system, that record is sealed. And so now in my cases, when I get a person's criminal history, I wouldn't see what their juvenile history is, except in certain cases where it would be allowed, because it's sealed to the public. And that means that person does not have to report that they had been convicted of a crime that otherwise would have been considered a felony, because in the juvenile system, it is an adjudication and not a felony offense. And again, the focus is on rehabilitation. In the adult system, people are not protected from the harmful outcomes of having a felony conviction. And so the significance is, if we keep children in the juvenile system, we have the opportunity to be able to work with them, to be able to try to change the trajectory if we think that those individuals are on a wrong path. But once we shift them to that adult system, there is no longer a shield and protection there for those children. And so, again, in many states, there are ways to bring a child into the adult system, which in the state of Alabama is called to direct file a case. And what that means in our state is that actually an officer, a police officer or a prosecutor can actually make a case, initiate in adult court for anyone who is over the age of 14 years old. And what that means is that they never even go into the juvenile system. They go directly to adult court. Now, in some states, you have a process by which a person can try to transfer their case back to juvenile system, so they can make a case for why this particular case or individual is not appropriate for adult court, but not in Alabama. In Alabama, once a person is in the adult system, they're going to remain in the adult system. So unless their case is dismissed, it's going to be resolved in adult court. And if it's resolved with some type of plea or some type of conviction by jury, then there is going to be a felony conviction that child has on their record. And so In 2017, the governor at the time of Alabama put together a task force which was supposed to study the juvenile justice system. Alabama had decided that it was needed that they made some changes to the system. And so they came up with a study, or they conducted a study. That study showed that there were significant racial disparities throughout the system. So not just in one area, but in every area of juvenile justice. All the way down to education. They saw that there were disparities between Black children and children of other races. In cases of direct filing to adult court, which is what I just explained about sending children directly to adult court, which also means sending them directly to adult jails with adult men and women, which happens more often in this country than many of us think about. And the consequences of that, those consequences are very severe when it comes to individuals' mental health and also to their safety. As you can probably imagine, there are a lot of children who go to adult jails that end up being victims from their incarceration in those adult jails and also in adult prisons. But Black children make up 84% of all instances of cases that are direct file. So in Alabama, Black people make up less than 30% of the population holistically. So we're talking about 84% of our children are making up the numbers of individuals, children specifically, who are going to adult jails. And so what that means is that white children are getting the benefit of the doubt and getting to go to juvenile court, while our children are being pushed into the adult system. And ultimately, their lives are being much more harshly impacted by the outcome of that. In schools, they found that Black children receive 64% of school suspensions, even though they only made up 34% of the students. And Blacks, and particularly Black girls. And so if we just think to the narratives that we've been hearing just in the last week about the difference that Black women have made, not only in the election, but specifically they're talking about consistently carrying the Democratic Party. And then we compare that to what we're seeing happening to our Black girls in schools. We can see that the future of our Black girls looks a lot more dimmer if we don't make changes than they have before. Black students are 3.49 times more likely to be arrested in school. And then 54% of Black girls in the South, not just in Alabama, are more like 54% of all school suspensions are of Black girls in Southern states. And so just bringing this to a close, I just want to try to tie the idea all together. The idea is that when we look at the statistics that we have, I talked about Alabama, but we could really pull any state and come up with similar information. When we look at these statistics, what we see is that Black children are being funneled into our criminal justice system at higher rates than any other races. When they are funneled into the adult system, the outcomes are more harsh than they are if we were to take our child through the juvenile justice system. And because of that, what happens is that at very much earlier ages, children are losing their right to vote before they even reach the age of 18 where they can vote. And so we could talk about restoration processes and all the things that we can do to try to fix that on the back end. But the reality is, when we look at the studies and the data, those restoration processes don't work. Even if we look at Florida, where they did an amendment to just all at once give people their right to vote, we know that a lot of people still weren't able to vote based on fines that were many years old that thankfully people came forward and helped pay for them. So it's not as easy to undo on the back end as if we take action on the front end. But I think that as a community, we want to pay attention to these types of things, because ultimately, if we don't pay attention to what's happening to our youth now, we're going to see it years from now affecting our ability to be able to have a collective voice in this country as a Black community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Attorney McCrary. You you just blew my mind, our mind, with those statistics, especially that 84% of the students who are of the young people who are in adult court. back to JaMyia McNeil to introduce to us Dr. Sowande Mustakeem. JaMyia?
Okay, Dr. Sowande Mustakeem earned a bachelor's degree from Ellen after completing an independent major in African American Studies. She received her master's degree in African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University in 2002 and 2008. She subsequently received a 2-year Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in history and a jointly appointed tenure-track position in history and African American Studies at Washington University. Sowande Mustakeem's award-winning Slavery at Sea, Terror, Sex, and Sickness in the Middle Passage disrupts that narrative. Mustakeem changes how readers understand the packaging process for how African captives become enslaved once they've reached their final destinations. Slavery at Sea reveals the first time how similar dimensions of land-based slavery were expressed largely on board slaving vessels. By highlighting the lived experiences of those groups most neglected by prior scholars of the Middle Passage, women, children, and disabled and elderly, Mustakeem demonstrates how Atlantic slave ships were important areas of development to land-based methods of medical treatment and violence. This is Dr. Sowande Mustakeem.
All right. Hello. Can you all hear me? Can you all see the blood? Is it bright red? I hope so.
It's bright red.
Good. I want us to keep the blood in mind as I'm talking, because of course, yes, I am. Well, let me highlight that this is actually the cover of Slavery at Sea, Terror, Sex, and Sickness in the Middle Passage. I'm very grateful to Dr. Hodges and Dr. Warren and the entire staff at Tuskegee and for Tuskegee having me here and back. I'm excited to be here. You're catching me at a moment between class and in between panels. So all of this is very relevant. And I want to jump right in because we're not quite going to talk about my book because there was so much that we already were able to learn from Attorney McCrary. And I want to speak from that because what is very interesting, and everything is always entwined, because she would start with Souls of Black Folks, interlinking me to Du Bois, of which Slavery at Sea is. Because with Slavery at Sea, it came out in 2016. And Du Bois, when he finished his Ph.D. from Harvard in 1896, that would be the first book ever to center the conversation on the slave trade. So then now to think about the criminalizing, the containment, control of Black people and its larger legacies, it starts with Du Bois, and then as we're thinking about this flow of remembrance, if we will. So if I'm not really a numbers person. I love numbers, but yet I like the social histories. But yet if I were to give us some numbers so we can understand how I feel even more connected to this, is because in 1989, my father would go to jail for 11 years. And then he would go back to jail for 11 years and he would get out in 2015. And then he would pass away in 2018. So what that means is that I've been confronted with this ever-changing system and this carceral system and the hyper visibility of Black men, but also this larger narrative of families that are connected to the consequences of the system. So essentially, already I don't fit the stereotype. Here it is that I have a PhD. I'm the first African-American to ever get tenure in the history department in African and African-American studies at Washington University. So already I'm moving beyond our traditional understandings of a so-called criminal. And yet, yes, he was charged with a crime, nonviolent, but yet would go in and out of these carceral spaces that we know, we don't know, we know we don't need them, but yet there's been a larger history that goes back to slavery. It goes back to not even the plantations. It goes back to the buying and selling and essentially this global commercial market that would go on for over 4 centuries. So when we think about the disenfranchisement, we have to think about the laws that are made on the people and the allocation of money that is really all about the movement of laborers. It is all about creating a larger system. So the disenfranchisement, essentially the control and the confinement and the regulating of Black bodies, it never began on land. it really becomes solidified at sea. But it is because of the movement of money and people and goods and ideas that then give way over time. So what we come to understand within the Jim Crow, and also the new Jim Crow, of which Michelle Alexander would aptly define as we're beginning to think about our present moment, there is the interlinking of these systems of slavery at sea, but also slavery on land. And then what is freedom, when Alabama really would be that central place where the unmaking of freedom will be continuous, meaning that with the coming of so-called freedom would, as we have learned, we're seeing that the opening of this whole other system to re-enslave, to reinscribe power, and essentially to make money off of within the convict lease system. And this is a history that includes Black males as well as Black females. And so when we're thinking about crime and criminality, we also have to think about what is freedom and what are the narratives that we are telling ourselves. So I am just coming from a class that I developed because of Trayvon Martin. When he was murdered, I knew that we needed to talk about how this policing within Black communities happens, but then also how crime is attached historically and over time, whether it happens, but it also is how it's read on Black bodies. So when we're thinking about Black votes, it is also about Black bodies. And again, I call attention and remind us about the bloodshed, because with Black bodies and with the bloodshed, that then becomes a much bigger narrative that we have to account for in a country that is now having to reckon with a long history of bloodshed that really permeates many of our streets and across the nation and really the international globe, again, because of the violent assault continuously upon Black people. But within this course that I developed, mapping the world of quote unquote Black criminality, I'm just coming from students really reckoning with exactly what we're talking about. What does it mean when the laws are made to really maintain white supremacy? What does it mean in our memory? What do we want to remember? How are the stories told? And yet, do we all know it? How far are we in our lexicon of who is central to this history? So again, when we're thinking about where we are now with Black votes, and we've got to think about the future. So Attorney McCrary, I can't thank you enough, because as one who has taken students into the juvenile detention or into these juvenile spaces of containment and confinement here in St. Louis, the future really doesn't look all that bright when we're looking at the world that they're confined within, and then trying to imagine that within a COVID world of which we cannot escape, that we are now. But also thinking about the labeling, to move in and out of these carceral spaces as an adult, as a child, as an elder, then to be marked as criminal. And who really wants to remember a criminal? And yet, what does that mean? Did it really matter what type of crime that happened? It all should matter. But then it's also about the stories, the histories, the herstories, but also the remembrance. You're always going to hear me mention about remembrance, because there is a restoration that has to happen. And the restoration really is us coming full circle in again, the narratives that we are centering. So we are at a very unique place in thinking about crime in America. And what does that mean? Also generationally, how have the laws been remembered? How have people been treated? How have we remembered that? And then now, if we're all invoking, or a lot of people are invoking, criminalizing and decriminalizing a system, what can that look like? So I'm very much one who is anchored on tangibles. And that's why it's so powerful what Attorney McCrary is getting us to see, to think about these future narratives, again, that are told. Because if we look even 4 years from now, the vote is already impacted when we're looking at, yes, this surge in crime, and I'll be honest, a surge in what I'm seeing here in St. Louis of violent crime that is happening at ages 13 and 14. And so that means in 4 and 5 years, of course, the vote is going to be impacted. They will have been put in the system. And then yet we don't even know how long the entanglements and these connections to these carceral spaces go. Meaning, if we are seeing other family members and those family members then going in. So the whole thing is that we're staring at the future right now. And then what is it that we can learn from the past? And one of the biggest things is really broadening our spectrum. So I'm teaching 13th in my course, but I put it at the end because we need to go deeper in our understanding of where are Black women, where are Black girls, where are those narratives when we're thinking about a bigger, broader spectrum. And that is really because in my world of studying slavery at sea, we can't just say women and men. That doesn't really tell me everything when you do have the variations of age. You have children, you have elderly, you have those who just kind of don't fit all our traditional understandings. So where we are and where we need to go is to deepen the conversation. Whether we're thinking about the book Arrested Justice, the rise of this prison nation and where and how Black women fit into it, or also the book Breaking Women, when we're thinking about these carceral spaces and then those who are freed, what is being carried? What are the traumas that are being brought into these worlds? So again, in our future narratives, we have no choice but to be even more attentive to the consequences and the complications of the mind and of the evolution of isolation. And then again, in these stories, and then yet in the herstories that are being told. So I agree that a lot of these systems and these institutions, they are all about maintaining the power of the elite. It is all about status. It is about these layers and these hierarchies of power, but then it's about where and how we understand that and where and how we translate that to the next generation. What do laws mean? What does codified mean? Where and how do we see laws change over time? If so-called freedom happens, then what does it mean when new laws are created over and over to regulate all Black bodies, female, male, child, as well as elderly? So I found it very interesting, well, not interesting, but just sort of thinking about 1901, what does that represent in many people's minds? And to think about the Constitution and the laws, very, very, very impactful. And then I think about where I'm going in my next book is looking at the movement of women, both Black and white, in and out of these carceral spaces, that there's a Black woman who I have found that, yes, faced what I call this pyramid of power, and she murdered another Black woman in 1891 and was freed in 1901. And she actually was freed on the 4th of July, 1901. So that only complicates the whole idea of freedom and what does it mean to be freed from jail or penitentiary in a new century, and also to be born outside of slavery. So there's so many different narratives that are they're all worthy and necessary for our remembrance. And so again, the legacies are about what is told and then yet what is remembered. And as I sort of really think about even pointing to the 2008 election of Obama, I remember talking with my father and he had a completely different view of Obama being inside of a federal prison. And then how he would say to me that, was sort of filtering throughout the prison where he was, like, yeah, Obama's gonna free us. And I just remember thinking, wow, the celebratory side of it, but then yet the reality of, could this one person then be what someone within a prison and how they would sort of imagine an African American within that top power role. So again, I'm just inviting I'm inviting you all to think, even from my perspective, to be in conversations with a father who was in a federal prison, and then to be thinking about hopefully the coming of his freedom, which did come, but then ironically for him to die 3 years after. And in fact, I'll tell you, I'm glad that he's not here now, because with COVID, that would only reinscribe a whole other sense of isolation that we may forget that comes with just even having been incarcerated itself. But where we're going and where we need to be in the future is to think about the vote, is to think about the youth, and then also to think about how different generations are approaching one another but also how we can mobilize together, because there's just different socialization that is going. I mean, right now, look at how we are all accessing one another within technology. Yes, that's sort of forced for the moment, but we've got to sort of use these as opportunities to begin to even more connect these generations. So I want to end and sort of really open up with where, again, Attorney McCrary has gotten us to think about if the juvenile work, and we're saying within those spaces, it's all about the rehabilitation. What does that mean? And yet, what rehabilitation can we enact within our own communities that can allow for us to expand and to grow in even deeper ways? And I think one of the primary bases is the histories and the herstories that we do tell, both from slavery and freedom, and then well beyond. So I'm just so grateful that I actually was really able to be a part of this, because this is very much a moment of uplift, and this is a turning point and a transformational point in the learning, and then yet what we do with it in the future and our engagement with generations and those to come. So I want to sort of end and begin here, only say that because my time is limited as I begin to prepare for another panel. But Attorney McCrary, I want to thank you for a powerful presentation. And I really just wanted to speak to some of the things that you have brought up. And again, I hope that everyone got a lot from it, because I did, as one who is ever learning. And this is just a very vibrant conversation and very relevant and critical all around. So.
Dr. Mustakeem, how much time do you have before you have to go?
I have probably about 20 minutes.
Okay, perfect. That's all we need.
Maybe, okay.
That's all we need. As JaMyia McNeil she's gonna go through the questions and prepare to ask the questions that persons have put in there. But while she's doing that, while she's picking the questions, I want to put out a question myself, because I am so deeply disturbed. First of all, we had the first mass incarceration, which was really so-called slavery. And then we had the second mass incarceration, basically called slavery by another name, right? Then we had a third mass incarceration, is what we call mass incarceration today, the placing Black and brown people in prison and locking them up. And now we actually have a fourth mass incarceration in my own mind, and that is screen time. And now it's funny that we have to use screen time, but the level of screen time by our young Black people have created all kinds of health problems and public health problems in terms of obesity, in terms of diabetes and hypertension, and young kids with self-isolating. Well, that's what Dr. Warren pointed out to us. We don't need to use the word social distancing. We need to use the word physical distancing, because we want to be socially close. And this conversation is making us socially close. And that's important, because with the online bullying and social media being what it is, or the level of suicide among young Black and brown people are going up, which is particularly strange, because Black and brown people have always tried to live. We're not trying to kill ourselves. Ida B. Wells Barnett escaped the South trying to live, So how do we trim the tide? So what I want to put forth to you is given all of these dispensational shifts in our history, and given the what we call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences that creates trauma, you have given us a wonderful picture, both of you, Attorney McCrary and Dr. Mustakeem, have given us a wonderful picture of what the situation looks like, and you've given us some snippets of what we can go. But I'm absolutely terrified about these young children who are put in the adult system, is there anything that we can do, either the National Center for Bioethics and Research and Public Health and Bioethics, is there anything that we can do from the outside to impact? Because the vote, we have the vote. That's one way. You all mentioned that. But what else can we do to make an impact? 84% is excruciatingly high. So I would like for you all to respond to that. And then Ms. McNeil is going to ask you questions that were posed by the audience.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very great question. And I enjoyed the response so much. It was really powerful and I truly enjoyed it. I'm able to see across the spectrum what you were talking about and how that connects us, which I think is very important, because we can't really talk about where we're going to go without knowing about where we came from. I think as it relates to what we can do, I think there has to be some involvement and not just casting a vote, but I think we have to get involved. Based on the statistics, we need to start with our children at school, right? If a lot of kids are entering into the juvenile system from school suspensions or from being directed to police departments when they get into trouble at school, for example, I often talk about my daughter who's now 17 and on her way to college at the end of this year. Well, when she was 12, she was having a horrible time. And I remember in middle school, 7th grade, she got into a fight. And I got a call that she was in a police car and taken to the juvenile detention center. And here I am representing youth at the Southern Poverty Law Center, out talking, engaging, being an advocate, and here my child is carted off to the juvenile system. And even then, I went to the school, I hired an attorney, and still it took a lot to be able to try to protect her from the natural consequences that come from something like that. I mean, that was 5 years ago. Now she's doing well. I mean, here she is, college ready, and has a bright future ahead of her. Not she had someone to be able to advocate for her, the end of her story could be much different than what I believe it's going to be now. So I think we have to begin to enter into those spaces, not only if we have children, but as community members, as people who are connected to a university. I think the programming that's offered to youth, their ability to be able to come in and see what life is like beyond that teenage age, being able to have relationships with our school leaders, with people in law enforcement, to be able to know that the students who are impacted or the children who are impacted, actually that there is a larger community behind them, protecting them and ready to advocate on their behalf.
Thank you for that question. And again, as one who loves tangible solutions, let me go there. The power of the curriculum, okay? That means both the curriculum within the juvenile system, as well as the curriculum or also access to books. Or what I'm pointing to is that my book is banned for some people in prison because of what it can invoke. So we've got to think about the constant regulation and access or lack thereof to these narratives. Now, this also goes to a level of what we're going to need to do, or what I would suggest is that we need to see parents and neighbors really getting together and community leaders reading together these tangible narratives. If you want to point to Getting Played by Jody Miller, it's a very disturbing book that really looked at all of these young girls in St. Louis, what is happening internally within the community, as well as what is sort of like the lack of the conversations on what is happening to young girls. I just feel like we've got to do a better job of moving young girls and Black women from the shadows of our understanding of the carceral system and the policing, and do a better job of now imagining what about when a female and a male comes in and out of a prison, yet how can we be prepared? And then yet, how can we educate them if they're in the system? So again, I'm pointing to curriculum. I know everybody doesn't read, but then we better really think about what is the next generation doing. Do we then need to all go and talk about the new artists, the music, the albums that people are being access to, and then the stories that are being told within that? So curriculum, and then yet what will transfer to the future. I hope I'm making sense with that.
JaMyia?
Okay, this is a question from Vantrice Hurt. It's a question for Attorney Latasha McCrary. What will be the impact on the Black community because of the recent amendments passed in Alabama? And they are Amendment 1, which limits voting to U.S. citizens who are 18 or older, and Amendment 4, which authorizes the legislature to recompile the Alabama Constitution.
So let me start with Amendment 4. I think a lot of, I voted yes for Amendment 4 personally. Going back to what I was talking about in my presentation about, I mean, we're still talking about this 1901 Constitution here in 2020 and the impacts that it has. I mean, we have to have an amendment just to take out language that we all know is racial and wrong. So I think with laws, it's really sometimes hard to tell what the impact will be. Because again, as was said in the prior presentation, you can have changes in laws on paper without any actual action taken towards that. Or you can have laws on paper that then don't have the funding behind them to actually execute what the law says. Or you can have people that just get in the way and stall the actual action that could take place once the law is changed. So I think it's kind of hard to tell what will happen in Alabama specifically regarding recompiling, coming together to change the Constitution. But what I do hope is that it opens the door for at least the possibility. And it took us to 2020 to get here, so that has to account for something. But I think as individuals, what we have to now do is go beyond just voting for the change in the law and actually hold our legislators accountable for actually making it happen. And also be concerned about who gets invited to that convention, who's in the room, who gets to represent us as citizens, because we know that it makes a difference who's at the table. And so we want to have people who are at the table who are going to be considerate of our interests, whether that is as a woman or a male, or if that is as you know, a child, a Black person, a Latino person. I think it all makes a difference. We want to have representation so that the next Constitution that could come about looks a lot different than the one that we had before. In terms of Amendment 1, again, I don't know. I mean, simply saying that only US citizens can vote, I mean, I don't know how much of a difference that's going to make than what we're already doing. I don't, in practice, because there are already stipulations in place on, you know, a person's status and what it means, or what requirements they have to meet in order to be able to vote. I have a very close friend who is from Uganda, came to this country when she was 12 years old, and she wasn't able to vote until the prior election. That was her first time. It was a very momentous moment for her and her husband. But even though she was, she had been raised here in this country, and she obviously was very invested in this country, also a lawyer and great citizen, and she still couldn't vote just based on the fact that she wasn't a permanent citizen at that time. And so I don't know that that change itself is going to make that much of a difference. I feel like in Alabama, often we do stuff just to say it's done. It doesn't really have an impact. Sometimes it's just kind of to make people feel like something is happening when it's not. And I feel like maybe that amendment was one of those things.
A question from Houston Brown. Often Blacks are concerned about how they can follow the law, while whites put emphasis on how to find loopholes in the law. Two different mindsets, hence we have the criminalization of color. Delineation of race is merely a form of branding to determine who can be a supremacist or who will be chattel. Do you have any thoughts on this matter? And I believe that's just for anyone.
Well, I just want to affirm it's very true. You know, as one who loves movie and pop culture, I'm really thinking about this movie, Law Abiding Citizen. And the whole basis of it is how a white male is able to really understand the law and use it to his own advantage. And we see this over and over in movies. And then it becomes, or just in the everyday. So then it should translate for a lot of us. This is where the bottom line does matter. This is where new laws, new policies, and keeping up with that the ever-changing landscape of laws and bills, and even over time. Because when we get lost in, oh, this is new, this is the first time ever, then we won't see how some things are really just remade in a different form. But if we didn't remember, then, well, yeah, we got that over on them. So I just really want to affirm and underscore, we need, if we're going to remember slavery, then we need to remember not only Code Noir, then we need to remember what lays the precedent before, like for it to start really essentially in the 15th century. So again, this whole notion of maintaining a system and how you can manipulate it and use it to your advantage racially has gone on for many centuries that now we need to take a much closer look at.
Next question is from Gwendolyn West. What is a solution for the Black community to get on board of creating a better community, since the children are our future?
Attorney McCrary, you
Well,
can start.
I mean, I think there can be many answers to that. I don't think that there's one specific answer. I do agree that children are our future, and I think that it's wise of us to be thinking about what the next generation is going to look like, whether that's us talking about all now living in this post-COVID world, or not quite post, but the world that we live in now, and recognizing that we also have to change with the times as adults. I mean, thinking about how we can be more effective communicators to our children. And so as you all have like changed your platform from doing this in person and then being able to switch in a matter of months to doing this online, I think we have to just do that, take that practice in real life, and transfer it to many things, meaning we have to be able to adapt as our children are adapting. And so I think we have to meet our kids where they're at. I think about, the type of things that I learned, the type of programming that we had when I was a child at a Baptist church growing up. Those things don't work for our kids now. My daughter would be bored out of her mind if she had to wait until Easter Sunday to do something at church. And so I think it's just a matter of, I think in large part, we have to try to kind of meet our children where they're at, and to be able to try to build a bridge that gaps prior generations to current generations, so that we can understand what their needs are, and then think about what the solutions can be in order to be able to help our kids.
All right, we have now what we had at the end, and so Attorney McCrary and Dr. Sowande Mustakeem, you all have done such a tremendous job. Can you give us a last statement to close out, something that we could chomp on the bits as we move forward into our next session?
Yes, I think that we need to maybe really up the rigor of at-home learning of Black history and the evolution of Black culture. The moment that we just rely on school systems that are not invested in the telling and the remembrance of Black history, then we're already failing our future in that regard. So it's where and how we can go deeper in our own lexicon to teach the next generation, and then holding ourselves accountable even more. So history matters, and Black history matters.
And I would only add to that in saying that I agree that when we allow other people to tell our story, if that's all that we allow, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. I think the connecting piece here is that when I was saying in my presentation that it is the police officers and the prosecutors who are making the decision on where those 84% of children go, those police officers are largely white. Those prosecutors are largely white. And so when we allow them to make the decision about the future of our children, guess what the decision is? It's to up the level of incarceration while they let their kids go to juvenile system. Our kids are going to adult jail. And again, I think that's just showing that when you allow someone else to be able to make the decision about our community, you're not going to get the best outcome that you might want for yourself. So again, it's about telling our own story, allowing the impact to come from our voices.
All right, thank you very much. I want to before you all go, and hopefully you're able to stay. I know Sowande, you have to run on and do another, but hold on one second. I want to read something that Kayla Lloyd said. She said, "Yes!" Exclamation point. I feel that all we talk about is Black men, which is needed in all caps, but we need to include Black women in the conversation. We're losing our Black women to kidnapping and killings, and we need to keep talking about it. You know, um, let me make a quick comment on this. Um, um, couple things. One is the victimization, the kidnapping, the violence on Black women has not only been historic, it is modern. Our Black women are disappearing. If you when you look at TV shows like Dateline and 2020, and you see all of them, so many of them lopsided, you would think that the criminal justice looked like that. Like white people committing crimes, and then they on a show called Dateline, Black people committing crimes, and they're incarcerated at a higher rate. So, well, if you want to give us equal time in prison, give us equal time on these television programs that kind of give voice to expose some of these things. But our young girls are disappearing. There was a big deal when the young lady Holland disappeared in Aruba several years ago. It was a huge thing. And of course, it was a tragedy. The disappearance of any child, I don't care what race it is a major tragedy. But at the same time, so many young girls of color have been disappearing. They're in slave trafficking. They're in prostitutional trafficking. They end up in all kind of spaces, and they end up in cemeteries, or not even. So, yes, I appreciate what you said, Kayla Lloyd, because is not one or the other, is both. Both the men and the women of color are compromised at such a degree that it creates some massive limitations on our children. Because the children, when the father and the mother taken away, the children are the ones who are harmed. I had the opportunity after my first book came out. It was called God for Silent Tears. I was invited to a women's prison in Louisiana. Prison in Louisiana. I was invited to speak to women. The book is God for Silent Tears, Women of the Bible, Healing Women of Today. So it was a book about women, essentially. So I was invited to preach to women. And I got there and said, well, since you're early, can you speak to the men too? So there's two sides of this prison. So they brought the men in, and that's the best church, Dr. Warren. When you have a captive audience, they can't go anywhere. So 1,000 men in the room, and I preached. And I don't think I've ever achieved a higher height in my preaching because I saw these men break down into a kind of infantile regression. The following day, when I preached to the women, what blew me away, because I have over 100 nieces and nephews. Somebody talked about how big their family was. There's 12 of us, and then there's over 100 nieces and nephews and great nieces. I don't even know their names anymore. But when I preached, I looked at that audience and I saw some beautiful young women, some beautiful women, and then you got some that look very rough, really, really rough. So I asked the warden, why are so many women in prison? There's 1,000 of them here? And she said to me, well, you said it in your book. I said, well, what did I say? I wrote it some time back. She said, 92% of the women here are here because of a man. Most of them are here because they were a drug mule. They were carrying drugs for their boyfriends or their husbands or whoever. The tragedy against women is just as vicious and in some degree, depends on how you look at it, even more vicious against women is atrocious. And that's why I'm glad that Mr. Donald Trump can kind of go on about his business. The next thing I want to say in terms of what your presentation is that I am blown away by if former felons who have gone to prison, paid their time, done what they were supposed to do, and they come out and they can't vote, they should not be taxed. Because you have taxation without representation. Why are you taxing these people with the little dollars that they're making after prison and they can't vote? So if I can't vote, you shouldn't be able to tax me. So that's just my little statement there. So I want to thank you, first of all, JaMyia McNeil. She is the recipient of the Voices for Our Fathers Scholarship. And we are so, like I said before, we're so proud of JaMyia McNeil. Of course, the Voices for Our Fathers are the descendants of the men who were in the syphilis study. I should say the men and women. We don't include the women, but they were there. They were the wives. They were the daughters. They were the sisters, the aunties, right? The grandmothers. So they are the descendants. And JaMyia McNeil, we're so proud of you for being the recipient of that scholarship, JaMyia. And we love you. You did a wonderful job today, and we really, really appreciate you. Attorney McCrary, every time we call Attorney McCrary, either to write an article or to present, she always says yes. So we thank you for always saying yes. And so Sowande tried to say she's busy. I said, I don't care. Fit us in. And she said, I got 2 things. Just squeeze us in, because what Dr. Mustakeem brings to the table is when she was on campus last year with her little backpack walking on the campus, she looked like a little student. We knew then, Dr. Warren, that she was one of us for life. You are a Tuskegee lifer.
You got it. I look forward to when I'm back there with you all.
Yeah, exactly. You always have
the energy, but it really has been an honor. I'm so grateful to everyone being here as well.
Thank you. So both of you, Attorney McCrary and Dr. Mustakeem, both of you have been to the campus, and we just love you. We love you. We appreciate you for coming. Now,